Richard Whitmore spoke, then placed a bank card and a thick stack of cash on the wooden plank beside Annie. She froze. Her eyes rested on the money for several seconds before slowly moving to the man standing in front of her. "You want this food box?" Richard nodded. "Yes, I want that box." Annie tightened both hands around the faded blue handle. Her fingers, coated with white cement dust, pressed tightly together. "But it is not worth anything, sir." "That does not matter." Richard glanced at the old closed lid. "I have not eaten since this morning. I am very hungry." Annie looked at him, surprise clearly written across her face. "You are really that hungry?" "Yes." She hesitated. Richard's white shirt remained crisp despite the harsh midday sun beating down on the construction site. His watch caught the light whenever he moved. Even his shoes were cleaner than anything Annie was wearing. "You are dressed so nicely," she said quietly. "The food I brought is not good enough for you." Not far away, two workers sitting beside a stack of lumber had stopped talking. Earl Maddox wiped the sweat from his face with the red cloth around his neck and gave a dry laugh. "She is acting like there is gold in that box," he said. "The man says he is hungry, and she keeps asking questions." Pete Lawson looked toward Richard. "Mr. Whitmore, you should not eat whatever is inside that old box. We can call the food truck back. They have pulled pork, grilled chicken, anything you want." Earl pointed at the lunchbox in Annie's hands. "There is probably nothing inside except a crushed sandwich and an apple left over from last week." Pete laughed with him. "You own an entire row of buildings in Atlanta. You do not need to eat food from a dented old box like that." Annie lowered her eyes. They were not speaking very loudly, but nearly everyone resting nearby could hear them. A few workers turned to look. Some remained silent. Some smirked. Others appeared uncomfortable, but said nothing. Heat rose from the concrete and closed around Annie's legs. Dust covered her sleeves. Sweat had dried into pale streaks along her neck and back. She knew what the box looked like. Most of the blue paint had peeled away from the corners. One side had a deep dent from the day it fell from a bus. Near the handle, the letters JC had been carved with the point of a knife years earlier. Her father's initials. Annie washed the box every night. She scrubbed the dirt from every narrow seam, but no amount of soap could make it look new again. Richard did not look at Earl or Pete. He continued watching Annie. "What did you bring?" She swallowed hard. "Just a sandwich, an apple, and some water." "That sounds fine. It is peanut butter and jelly." "I have eaten peanut butter and jelly before." Annie looked at the money again. There was more cash on the wooden plank than she had ever held at one time. Only part of it would be enough to pay the electric bill with the red notice taped to the refrigerator. It could cover the overdue rent before the landlord came knocking again. It could pay for all the medicine waiting behind the pharmacy counter, where the pharmacist was holding it because Annie had not been able to pay the full amount. The bank card rested on top of the cash. Richard had not said how much money was on it, but Annie knew it was worth far more than one poor lunch. Earl shook his head. "Now she is being selfish. If someone is hungry and asks for food, just give it to him. Why stand there acting like this is some major business deal?" Pete added. "Especially when he is offering enough money to buy her 100 lunches." Annie's cheeks burned. She wanted to say that she had not eaten anything that morning. She wanted to explain that the sandwich had to keep her standing through the afternoon shift and another 4 hours washing glasses and wiping tables at Rosie's Cafe. She wanted to tell them that the night before, she had eaten only one leftover cookie after closing, then gone home and lied to her mother that she had shared a full meal with her coworkers. But Annie knew that when poor people explained themselves, others rarely listened to understand. They listened to judge. They asked where the money had gone, why she had not found a better job, why she had not asked relatives for help, and how she had allowed her life to become so difficult. When poverty was explained in front of strangers, it stopped being a circumstance. It became something for others to inspect. So Annie said nothing. Richard pushed the bank card and the cash closer to her. "Well?" he asked. "Do you agree?" Before Annie could answer, Earl stepped forward. "Mr. Whitmore, forget that box. Pete and I can get you real food. There is a steakhouse 10 minutes from here. Whatever you want, we can bring it." Pete nodded quickly. "Or I can call the diner near Highway 16. Fried chicken, mashed potatoes, butter biscuits. You do not need whatever that girl brought." Earl glanced at Annie. Maybe this is the best meal she has ever had. That must be why she is holding on to it so tightly. A few workers turned away, but Earl continued, seeming to enjoy the attention more with every word. Come on, Annie. What is inside? Caviar? A 5-course meal packed into that tiny rusted box? Pete laughed. Maybe she thinks the sandwich is worth more than all that money. Earl moved closer. Or maybe it is the most valuable thing she has ever owned. Look at the way she is holding it. Maybe she has never had anything better in her life. Annie's fingers tightened around the handle until they hurt. Please stop, she said. Her voice was so quiet that it was almost swallowed by the machinery in the distance. Earl did not stop. You hear that, Mr. Whitmore? She wants you to pay for the privilege of eating a cheap sandwich. I did not say that. Annie's voice began to tremble. Pete shrugged, then handed over. You are making something simple more difficult than it needs to be. I said stop. This time, her voice broke. Earl smiled as though her pain had proved him right. Look at her. She is about to cry over one little lunch. You would think she was protecting a family treasure. Annie lowered her head. A tear fell onto the back of her hand before she could wipe it away. She turned her face aside, hoping no one would notice. But another tear slid down her dust-streaked cheek. Annie pulled the food box closer to her chest. Not because it was worth more than her mother's medicine. Not because she valued the sandwich more than the money in front of her. It was simply the only meal she had for the entire day. And the box was the last thing she still had from her father. Richard turned toward Earl. That is enough. His voice was not loud, but the smile disappeared from Earl's face at once. I was only saying, I have heard enough. Earl stepped back. Richard looked at Annie. The tears on her face disturbed him in a way he had not expected. He had only meant to test her. The site manager had told him that Annie was the poorest worker there. During the day, she cleared rubble. At night, she worked at a cafe to pay for her mother's medicine. Richard had wanted to know whether, when faced with money, she would trade away the little food she had. But he had not considered that the test would unfold in front of so many people. He had not expected those two men to use Annie's poverty as an excuse to crush her dignity. And worst of all, he was the one who had put her in that position. Richard pushed the cash toward Annie one more time. You can take all of it, he said. The card too. I only want the box. Annie looked at the money. Her breathing became uneven. In her mind, she saw the pharmacy counter again, with bottles labeled in her mother's name. She saw the electric bill. She remembered the landlord pounding on the door, and her mother saying they could endure the cold for a few more days if they still did not have enough money. All she had to do was hand over the box, and everything could change immediately. But Richard had said he was hungry. Annie lifted her head. If I give it to you, she asked, will you really eat what is inside? Richard hesitated. Yes. Will you eat all of it? If I can. You will not open it and laugh because the food is too poor? Richard was silent for a moment. No. And you are not doing this so everyone can laugh at me? Richard glanced at Earl and Pete. No, he said. I am not. Annie studied his face as though trying to decide whether the answer was true. Then she released one hand from the handle and wiped away her tears with the back of it. The sandwich inside had been made before sunrise in the small kitchen she shared with her mother. Annie had spread the peanut butter very thin so there would be enough left for the next day. The apple had been given to her by a shopkeeper because it had already begun to soften. Annie understood hunger. She knew it was not only the sound of an empty stomach. It was the dizziness that came when she stood too quickly. It was hands trembling halfway through a shift. It was going to bed early, so she would not have to think about food. She understood hunger better than bank cards, investment accounts, or men who stepped out of luxury cars with assistants walking behind them. In her mind, she heard her mother's voice from the years they had spent sitting together at their small kitchen table. Help offered in exchange for gain was only a transaction. Food given to someone who was hungry was kindness. Annie stepped closer to the wooden plank. She placed the food box beside the money. Then, in front of everyone, she gently pushed the bank card and the entire stack of cash back toward Richard. Earl stopped laughing. Pete opened his mouth but could not speak. Richard looked down at the money, then at Annie. She lifted the box again and offered it to him with both hands. You do not need to pay me, sir. Her voice still trembled, but every word was clear. If you are hungry, please eat. Richard did not reach for it. You said that is all you brought. Yes, sir. Then what will you eat this afternoon? Annie tried to smile, though tears still clung to her lashes. I will be fine. That is not an answer. The small smile disappeared. Annie lowered her voice. Nothing. Richard looked at her. Until when? Until after my evening shift. If the cafe has leftovers, they may let me take some home. Richard's expression changed. And if there are no leftovers? Annie lowered her eyes. I will drink water and go to sleep. What about your mother? I left food for her. You are going hungry so she can eat? Annie did not answer. Her silence said everything. She continued holding the food box out toward Richard. I cannot take this money just for feeding you, she said. My mother taught me that kindness stops being kindness when we put a price on it. Richard looked at her for a long time. But this money could buy your mother's medicine. I know. It could pay the rent. I know. It could keep you from working 2 jobs every day. Annie's eyes reddened again. I know. Then why are you still refusing? Annie looked directly at him. If you are truly hungry, I do not want you to have to buy my kindness. The entire break area fell silent. Annie continued, her voice tightening with emotion. And if you are only testing me, then I do not want to trade what my mother taught me for money. Richard could not speak. She moved the food box closer. Please eat. I can endure being hungry for one more afternoon. You still have to work under this sun. I will drink water. You could faint. Annie gave a small nod. Maybe. And you would still give it to me? Because you said you were hungry. Richard looked at the old food box in her hands. Then he looked at the 18-year-old girl with dusty shoes, a sunburned face, and hands roughened by hard labor. A girl who had almost nothing. Yet she was still willing to give away everything she had. Richard slowly reached out. Annie thought he was going to take the box, so she loosened her fingers. But he did not take it. Instead, he placed his palm beneath both of Annie's hands and carefully pushed the box back toward her. No, he said. His voice had dropped. You keep it. Confusion crossed Annie's face. But you said you were hungry. I am. Then why will you not eat? Richard looked at the scratched initials JC near the handle. Whose box is this? Annie lowered her eyes. My father's. Where is he? He passed away, sir. Richard went still. Annie pulled the box close to her body. This is the last thing I have left from him. And you were still willing to give it to me? You were not taking the box forever. You only needed the food inside. Richard turned away for a moment. When he looked back at Annie, his eyes had changed. He looked at the bank card and the stack of cash he had just used to measure a person he barely knew. Then he looked at Earl and Pete, who no longer dared to raise their heads. Finally, he looked back at Annie. You have already given me what I wanted, Richard said. Richard's words made Annie pull the lunchbox closer to her chest. She could not tell whether the exchange had ended or had simply shifted into another form she did not yet understand. The stack of cash and the bank card still lay on the wooden plank between them. They no longer looked like an offer. They looked like proof that, only minutes earlier, her kindness had been weighed and measured in front of dozens of people. Earl and Pete stood several yards away. Neither of them was laughing anymore. The workers nearby had returned to their paper bags and plastic containers, but their movements were slower now. A few pretended to focus on their food. Others glanced over and quickly looked away whenever they met Richard's eyes. He turned toward Earl and Pete. A minute ago, the two of you had plenty to say. Richard's voice was not loud, but it was enough to silence the entire lunch area. Now say it to her. Earl cleared his throat and forced an awkward smile. Mr. Whitmore, we were only joking. Richard looked directly at him. I did not ask what you were doing. He pointed toward Annie. I told you to speak to her. Pete looked down at his dust-covered boots. Sorry. Richard did not respond. He remained still and waited. Pete was forced to raise his head. I'm sorry, Annie. I should not have said those things. Earl shifted his weight, his discomfort plain on his face. Me too. Annie looked at them. She did not see genuine remorse in Earl's eyes. She saw only embarrassment at being forced to apologize in front of everyone. She gave a small nod. All right. Richard studied her face. You do not have to accept an apology simply because someone finally agrees to give one. Annie tightened her fingers around the handle of the lunchbox. I know. Then why did you say it was all right? She glanced toward the clock mounted on the site office. Because I do not want to spend the rest of my break talking about this. The answer left Richard silent for a moment. It was not her forgiveness that caught his attention. It was the way Annie was trying to reclaim the few quiet minutes she had left in a day that had already demanded too much from her. He turned toward Daniel. How much break time is left? Daniel checked his watch. 7 minutes. Richard looked across the site. Groups of workers sat beneath scaffolding. Beside stacks of lumber, or against unfinished concrete walls. Some had finished eating long ago. Others were carefully sharing bottles of water so they would last through the afternoon. A few had nothing but dry bread or a bag of potato chips. Give them an hour. Victor stepped forward immediately. Richard, the concrete trucks will be here in 20 minutes. Reschedule them. That will cost us money. Richard turned toward him. So will having workers collapse from heat exhaustion. Victor lowered his voice, though everyone nearby could still hear him. We cannot stop a project this large because one worker brought a small lunch. Annie's expression changed. She looked down at the lunchbox, as though his words had once again pushed all the attention back onto her. Richard noticed, this is not only about one lunch. He turned toward Claire. Call the barbecue restaurant near the highway. Order enough food for the entire site. Chicken, pulled pork, beans, coleslaw, cornbread, fruit, bottled water, and iced tea. Claire already had her phone out. For the entire site? Everyone. There are more than 200 workers. Then order for 250. Victor ran a hand across his mouth, trying to remain calm. You have a call with the lenders in 15 minutes. Move it. Claire looked up from her screen. They will not be happy. Richard looked at the workers sitting beneath the sun. They will survive. Whispers began spreading through the crowd. Daniel turned his face away to hide a smile. Richard looked back at Annie. You are done working for today. She immediately tightened her hold on the lunchbox. Sir, I can still work. I did not say you could not. Then why are you sending me home? Because Daniel told me you nearly fainted here 2 weeks ago, and because you just admitted that you would not eat anything until tonight. Annie turned toward Daniel. Her expression was not angry, but it was hurt. Daniel lowered his voice. Annie, I was only worried about you. She looked back at Richard. That does not mean I have to leave. It means you need food and rest. I need the hours. You will still be paid for the full day. Annie looked at Daniel again. Can he do that? Daniel folded his arms. He signs the checks. Annie did not look relieved. I do not want special treatment. Richard answered at once. Neither do I. I want a worker who can finish the week without collapsing onto the concrete. I will not collapse. You almost did before. That time was different. How? Annie opened her mouth, then stopped. She could have told him that her mother had suffered severe pain in the middle of the night, and Annie had spent the week's food money on medicine. She could have explained that she had worked 2 shifts in a row and arrived at the construction site after only 2 hours of sleep. But every explanation felt like peeling back another private part of her life in front of strangers. She did not want to do that. Richard noticed her hesitation and lowered his voice. I am not asking you to take the money. Annie looked at the cash still resting on the plank. But everything happening now makes it feel that way. What does? She raised her head. You found out I was poor. You brought out money to test me in front of everyone. Then, once you learned about my situation, you decided what I needed and started giving orders. Claire looked at Richard. Victor fell silent too. Everyone waited to see whether he would become angry. Richard did not defend himself. You are right. Annie paused. Perhaps she had expected an argument, an explanation that he had only meant well, or a reminder of who owned the site. Instead, Richard simply stood in front of her and admitted it. I handled this badly. If Annie's kindness and courage touched your heart, please like this video, comment where you are watching from, and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories. Annie said nothing. Richard continued. Then tell me what I need to do to make it less wrong. She looked toward the work crews, the site office, and then the road beyond the gate. Do not cut my hours. Agreed. Do not use my name in any company publicity. Agreed. No photographs. Agreed. And do not send anyone to my home unless my mother gives permission. Richard glanced at Claire. We can call first. Annie's eyes narrowed immediately. Call about what? A doctor. Her expression changed completely. She turned toward Daniel. You told him about my mother? Daniel stepped forward. I only said she was ill. You should not have. Annie, I only wanted... I know why you said it. Her voice was not raised, but it hardened. But it was still my story to tell. Daniel fell silent. Then he nodded. You are right, Richard said. No one will come to your home without your mother's permission. Claire can arrange an appointment at a clinic instead. Annie looked at him cautiously. We do not have insurance. The company can pay for the visit. Her eyes moved at once to the bank card. I told you I do not want your money. This is not payment for your lunch, but it still comes from you. Yes, Then what do you call it? Richard did not answer immediately. He looked around the construction site at the workers using their short break to divide water and food among themselves. Making something right. Annie frowned. Making what right? The fact that someone can work 2 jobs, one of them for my company, and still have to choose between eating and buying medicine. Victor let out a sharp breath. She does not work both jobs for us. Richard turned toward him. Is that the only thing you heard? Victor went silent. Annie watched them, then looked down at the dented lunchbox in her hands. She gently ran her thumb over the initials near the handle. 1 appointment, she said. My mother will decide whether she wants to go. Richard nodded. 1 appointment. No reporters. No. No photographs. No. No company employees coming to ask questions. No one. Claire began entering the information into her phone. I need a number where we can reach her. Annie hesitated for a long time. It was the only phone number she and her mother had. The old phone often died in the middle of the day, and one corner of the screen was cracked. Reading the number aloud to a stranger still felt like opening another door into their private lives. At last, she recited it slowly. Claire repeated it back to confirm, then saved it. 40 minutes later, 2 small delivery trucks pulled into the construction site. Folding tables were set up in a shaded area. Aluminum trays, paper plates, plastic forks, bottled water, and ice-filled coolers quickly covered the tables. The smell of barbecue spread across the site. Workers began arriving from every section. At first, they approached cautiously, but once Daniel announced that the meal was for everyone, the line quickly grew. Richard stayed. He missed the call with the lenders. Then he postponed his afternoon flight as well. Annie sat at the end of a long table beside Daniel. Her lunchbox remained closed and rested close to her feet, as though she feared someone might ask her to give it up again. She did not stand to get food right away. Only after every work crew had been called, and even the workers from the farthest section had received a plate, did she slowly walk toward the table. Daniel looked at her. Why did you not go first? Annie held the paper plate with both hands. I wanted to make sure everyone had enough. There is plenty. I know. Even so, she looked over the remaining trays before taking only a small portion. Pete approached, carrying 2 bottles of water. He placed one near Annie. Whatever my apology meant to you earlier, I want to say again that I truly am sorry. Annie looked at the bottle, then at him. Then next time, stop before someone more powerful has to tell you to. Pete nodded. You are right. He did not remain there waiting for forgiveness. He simply turned and returned to his seat. Earl did not approach Annie. He sat at another table with his head lowered, barely speaking to anyone. Richard stood in line for food with everyone else. There was no private table, no special plate. When Victor tried to bring him a separate meal, Richard handed it back. I will wait in line. That is not necessary. It is to me. He stood behind a group of electricians, holding the same paper plate as everyone else. After lunch, Claire approached Annie with a small card. The clinic appointment is tomorrow morning, she said. Transportation is available if your mother agrees to go. If she refuses, no one will call again to pressure her or come to your home. Annie accepted the card with both hands. Thank you. Richard wants to speak with you before you leave the site. Annie immediately became cautious. About what? Ayoub. She looked toward Richard. He was standing beside the site office with his sleeves rolled up. An older welder stood in front of him, pointing toward the temporary rest area and complaining about the lack of shade. Richard was not checking his watch. He was not interrupting either. For the first time that day, he was simply standing there and listening. Annie opened the lunchbox, placed the clinic card inside, and carefully closed the lid. What kind of job? She asked. Claire gave a small smile. One that does not involve carrying broken concrete. Annie held the box against her chest. Then he should be prepared to explain himself clearly. Explain what? Why he thinks I can do it. Claire studied her for a moment. Perhaps that is exactly what he is waiting for you to ask. Richard waited beside the site trailer while the last of the lunch tables were being cleared. He had removed his tie and folded it into his jacket pocket. Annie approached with the blue food box tucked under one arm. Claire remained nearby with her tablet. Daniel stood a few steps away, close enough to listen but far enough to let Annie speak for herself. Richard pointed toward the trailer. Would you sit down for a few minutes? Annie looked through the open door. The air conditioner hummed inside, and several project maps covered the walls. I can stand. All right. Richard leaned against the edge of a desk. Claire tells me you want to know why I think you can do the job. I do. You show up on time. Daniel says you remember instructions after hearing them once. You notice when equipment is left in the wrong place, and you've corrected delivery counts more than once. Annie turned toward Daniel. You told him all that? I told him what I've seen. Richard continued. The project office needs a paid trainee, data entry, timesheets, safety documents, purchase records. Claire would train you. Annie waited for him to explain the part he was leaving out. How long? 30 days to start. And after 30 days? If you do the work well, we discuss a permanent position. If I don't, you return to the labor crew, assuming you still want to. Annie looked down at the dust on her boots. I've never worked in an office. That's why it's called training. I don't know the software. You can learn it. You don't know that. No, Richard said. I don't. That's what the 30 days are for. His answer was direct enough to surprise her. Claire stepped closer. The position includes a regular schedule, a higher hourly rate, and access to the company health plan after the probation period. Annie looked at her. For my mother too? Dependents can be added if the employment requirements are met. She isn't my dependent on paper. We can review the rules. Annie's shoulders stiffened. So this is about the lunch. Richard answered before Claire could. The lunch made me pay attention. It doesn't qualify you for a job. Then what does? Your record here. I clean debris. You also catch mistakes. That doesn't mean I can work in there. Annie nodded toward the trailer. Richard studied her. Are you saying you can't? Or are you saying you don't want people watching you try? Her eyes narrowed. You think I'm afraid? I think you've had to protect yourself for a long time. That isn't an answer. No, he said. It's an observation. Annie shifted the food box beneath her arm. People already think I got a free meal because you felt sorry for me. What do you think they'll say if I walk into that office tomorrow? Daniel spoke from behind her. They'll say whatever lets them avoid looking at their own work. Annie turned. You don't have to hear it all day. No, Daniel said, but I've heard my share. She knew what he meant. Daniel had spent years moving through jobs where men with less experience questioned his authority before they followed it. Richard said, I can't promise people will be fair. Then what can you promise? A written job description, a standard trainee wage, clear performance reviews, no publicity, no photographs, no interviews. If you succeed, the record will show why. And if someone decides I don't fit, Claire will supervise you. Claire raised an eyebrow. That sounded more flattering in your head. Richard almost smiled. She will also document your work. Annie looked between them. I need time to think. How much? Until tomorrow. Richard checked the clock on the wall. Tomorrow morning. No, tomorrow afternoon. Why? Because I'm taking my mother to the clinic in the morning. Claire nodded. The appointment is at 9. Richard said, tomorrow afternoon then. Annie turned to leave, but he stopped her. One more thing. She faced him. If you accept, you stop working the night shift at the cafe during the 30 days. That isn't your decision. It affects whether you can do the job. The cafe paye me. So would this. The cafe is certain. Your offer isn't. Richard took a breath. Then, keep the cafe for the first week. After that, we review it. I'm not promising to quit. I'm not asking for a promise. Annie gave him a cautious nod and stepped outside. Daniel followed her toward the gate. You're going to say no, he said. I didn't say that. You have the look. What look? The one you get when someone offers help and you start searching for the trap. Annie stopped beside the supply shed. You think there isn't one? I think every opportunity has a cost. That doesn't make it a trap. I don't have office clothes. I don't know how to talk in meetings. I don't know half the words they use. You didn't know how to run the debris lift when you started here. That's different. You learned it in 2 days. Annie looked toward the office windows. Through the glass, Victor stood speaking to Richard. Even from a distance, Annie could see the displeasure in his posture. He doesn't want me in there. Daniel followed her gaze. Victor doesn't want anyone in there who asks why. That's supposed to make me feel better? No, it's supposed to make you think. Claire drove Annie home after the site closed. The black company sedan seemed too polished for her street. Annie asked to be dropped at the corner, but Claire continued to the house. If your mother is going to the clinic tomorrow, I need to confirm the address. You could have asked. I just did it badly. Annie glanced at her. Does everyone around Richard apologize that fast? No. Most people around Richard avoid admitting mistakes until a lawyer writes the sentence for them. That earned a small laugh from Annie. Evelyn was seated at the kitchen table when they entered. Several pill bottles stood beside a notebook filled with appointment dates and unpaid amounts. Annie introduced Claire and explained the clinic visit. Evelyn listened without interrupting. When Annie finished, her mother asked, "What does the company want in return?" "Nothing," Claire said. Evelyn looked at her. "Companies always want something. This appointment is not tied to employment." "And the office job?" "That depends on Annie's performance." Evelyn turned to her daughter. "Do you want it?" "I don't know." "That means yes, but you're scared to say it." Annie set the food box on the table. "I'm not scared." Evelyn lifted one of the empty medicine bottles. "You work all day, then serve coffee until midnight. You sleep 4 hours and call it strength. Sometimes fear dresses itself like responsibility." Annie looked away. Claire quietly excused herself and waited outside. Evelyn reached across the table. "You have carried this house long enough. I'm not leaving you. I didn't ask you to. What if I fail? Then you fail after trying something better. What if they only see the girl from the cleanup crew? Then make them look twice." The next morning, Annie took Evelyn to the clinic. The doctor adjusted 2 prescriptions, scheduled tests, and arranged a reduced-cost medication program. Nothing was photographed. No company representative entered the examination room. That afternoon, Annie returned to Whitmore Commons. Richard was in the trailer with Claire when she arrived. Victor stood near the filing cabinets. Annie placed the blue food box on the desk. "I'll do 30 days, she said. Richard nodded. "Good. I have conditions." Victor gave a quiet laugh. "Of course she does." Annie turned toward him. "Is there a problem?" Victor's smile faded. "Not yet." She looked back at Richard. "Standard pay. Written reviews. No publicity. My mother's care stays separate. If I fail, I hear the reason from Claire, not from rumors." Richard extended his hand. "Agreed." Annie shook it. The following morning, she removed her orange vest and hard hat and placed them inside her locker. She did not discard them. She set the blue food box beside them, closed the door, and walked toward the project office. Behind the glass, several employees had already noticed her coming. Annie kept walking. The security guard at the project office looked at Annie's temporary badge, then at her clothes, then back at the badge. "You're with cleanup?" "Project administration trainee." He turned the badge over as though the answer might be printed on the back. 2 office employees passed through the door without being stopped. "Who approved this?" "Claire Monroe." The guard picked up the desk phone. "I'm going to verify it." Annie stood beside the entrance while workers moved around her. She had expected questions, but not before she even reached her desk. Claire appeared from the hallway before the call connected. "She works here, Mr. Harris." The guard lowered the phone. "I was only following procedure." Claire glanced at the 2 employees disappearing around the corner. "Then follow it for everyone." Annie clipped the badge to her blouse and entered without commenting. She had chosen the plainest clothes she could afford. Dark slacks, a blue shirt, and flat shoes that pinched near the toes. She missed her work boots already. The office was colder than she expected. Air conditioning moved through the trailer while maps and construction schedules covered the walls. A coffee machine hissed near a cabinet. Phones rang. Keyboards clicked. And people spoke in the quick language of numbers, deadlines, and abbreviations. Claire led her to a desk near the document room. "You'll begin with timesheets and delivery logs." Annie looked at the 2 computer monitors. "Both of them? One is for the payroll system. The other is for project records. I've never used 2 at once." "You will by lunch." Claire handed her a spiral notebook. "Write down anything you don't understand. Ask before guessing. If you make an error, tell me before someone else finds it." Annie sat carefully. "What if I ask too many questions?" "Then I'll tell you." A woman at the next desk leaned toward another employee and whispered, "That's her." Annie heard it but kept her eyes on the screen. Claire began with the timekeeping program. She showed Annie how to locate employee numbers, contractor codes, shift hours, and overtime approvals. Annie wrote every step by hand. Why are these names yellow? She asked. Temporary workers. And the red marks? Missing information. What happens if it stays missing? Payroll holds the check. Annie looked closer. Even if the worker already did the hours? Yes. That doesn't seem right. It isn't always wrong either. Sometimes the supervisor forgets a code. Annie opened the first file and began entering figures. She moved slowly for the first half hour, then found a rhythm. By 10, she no longer needed Claire to remind her where the menus were. Victor passed her desk twice without speaking. On the third trip, he stopped. How is the experiment going? Annie looked up. The training? If that's what we're calling it. Claire turned from her desk. We're calling it the position named in her contract. Victor smiled. Of course. He placed a stack of folders beside Annie's keyboard. These need to be entered before lunch. Claire looked at the stack. Those are 6 weeks of delivery receipts. She said she learns quickly. Annie examined the first folder. What should I do if the receipt doesn't match the order? Victor had already begun walking away. Enter what's approved. That wasn't what I asked. He stopped and faced her. If the delivery receipt is different from the purchase order, which number do I use? The approved number. Even when the materials didn't arrive? Victor's voice became sharper. You are entering records, Annie. You are not auditing the company. Claire stepped in. Flag the difference and send it to me. Victor looked at Claire. You're encouraging her to question routine paperwork. I'm encouraging accurate records. He left without another word. At noon, Annie opened the blue food box at her desk. Inside were 2 sandwiches, an orange, and a bottle of water. Evelyn had insisted on packing the extra food after the clinic visit. A man from accounting walked past and nodded toward the box. Careful, someone might offer you another bank card. 2 employees laughed. Annie closed the lid. Claire looked up. Do you want me to address that? No. You don't have to ignore it. I don't want every stupid comment turned into a meeting. The man had already moved away, still smiling. Claire said, There's a difference between patience and permission. Annie reopened the box. I know. I'm deciding which one this is. After lunch, she began reviewing timesheets from the previous week. The work seemed simple until she noticed the same employee number appearing under 2 subcontractors. She checked the name, Frank Delaney. Annie knew Frank. He was an older welder who worked on the eastern side and complained about his knees every morning. He had worked more than 50 hours the previous week. The payroll screen showed 40. She checked the gate records. Frank had entered before 7 each morning and left after 6 on 3 days. Annie wrote the figures in her notebook. Then she found another worker with the same problem. And another. By 3 o'clock, she had 11 names. She carried the list to Claire. These hours are missing. Claire reviewed the page. They may have been moved to another project code. Why? Sometimes crews are reassigned. They weren't. I saw them here. Claire opened the payroll system and checked the records herself. You're sure? I worked beside Frank on Tuesday. He was still welding when I left. Claire's expression changed. Save the list. Don't alter anything yet. Victor entered the office as Annie returned to her desk. A few minutes later, Claire called a brief planning meeting. Annie sat near the end of the conference table with her notebook. The discussion moved through concrete schedules, water deliveries, equipment rentals, and labor costs. Annie noticed the outdoor crews were scheduled to receive only 1 water delivery the following day despite the heat forecast. She raised her hand slightly. Victor continued speaking. Annie tried again. Excuse me. He stopped. What? The water order for tomorrow is half the usual amount. We'll manage. The East crew ran out yesterday before 3. Victor looked around the table. Anything else? Annie lowered her hand. A white assistant named Mark studied the schedule, then said, Actually, Victor, we may need to double the water order. The forecast is above 95. Victor nodded. Good catch, Mark. Add another delivery. Annie stared at the figures in her notebook. After the meeting, Richard found her alone near the copying machine. How was your first day? I learned a lot. Are people treating you fairly? Annie thought about the guard, the comments, and Victor praising Mark for the same warning she had given moments earlier. They're treating me carefully, she said. Richard waited. That isn't the same thing. He frowned. What happened? Nothing I can't handle. That's not what I asked. Annie met his eyes. You gave me a chair in that room. Some of them still think I wandered in and sat down by mistake. Before Richard could respond, Claire called Annie back to the desk. The payroll system had finished loading older records. Annie opened the next file. Frank Delaney was not the only worker missing overtime. The same pattern appeared across 3 months, and every adjustment carried the same approval code. Victor Cranes. Annie checked the approval code 3 times before calling Claire over. She did not want to accuse anyone because of one screen or one pattern she did not yet understand. Claire leaned beside the monitor. Show me. Annie opened Frank Delaney's record, then the gate log, then the payroll summary. He worked 53 hours. He was paid for 40. Open the adjustment history. Annie clicked the tab. A line appeared near the bottom. Administrative correction. Claire read. Approved by V. Crane, Annie said. The same code appears on 10 other files. Claire pulled an empty chair closer. Go back another month. They found more. The missing hours did not appear under one crew or one supervisor. They appeared mostly among temporary laborers, older workers, and men who changed assignments during the week. A few hours vanished at a time, rarely enough to draw attention from someone reviewing totals. Annie wrote every name in her notebook. Claire watched her. How did you notice this? I know some of these people. Frank stays late. Luis worked Saturday because his wife was having surgery. Mr. Harlan never leaves before the welding crew locks the cages. You remember everyone's schedule? When you're clearing around them, you learn who is still standing there. Claire opened the project coding system. Some of the hours may have been transferred. To where? That's what we need to find. For the next hour, they followed the missing time through subcontractor numbers and internal project codes. Several entries ended under a labor supplier called Southridge Staffing. Annie searched the employee list. No workers are assigned to this company. Claire checked again. It may be inactive. Then why is it receiving hours? Claire did not answer. Victor appeared at the end of the aisle. What are you two doing? Reviewing payroll discrepancies, Claire said. I thought that had been settled. It hasn't. Victor stepped behind Annie's chair and looked at the screen. These are routine coding transfers. Annie turned toward him. Transfers to an inactive company? It's not inactive. There are no employees listed. Because Southridge handles administrative distribution, not direct labor. Annie looked back at the records. What does that mean? It means you don't understand the accounting structure. Then explain it. Victor's expression hardened. I don't have time to teach corporate finance to a trainee, Claire said. You have time to identify where the money went. The workers were paid. Not according to these records, Annie replied. Victor placed one hand on the back of her chair. You need to be careful about making accusations. I asked a question. You're suggesting theft. I said the hours are missing. They aren't missing. They were allocated to a company with no workers. Victor turned to Claire. This is exactly what I warned you about. She sees one number she doesn't recognize and decides she has uncovered a crime. Annie stood. She was smaller than Victor, but she did not step away from him. I know what one missing hour costs. Victor gave a humorless smile. That doesn't make you an accountant. No, it makes me someone who checks before taking it from a person's check. Claire closed the payroll screen. We're preserving the records and sending them to finance. Victor reached toward the keyboard. No, you're returning to the work assigned to you. Annie moved her hand over the mouse before he could touch it. The records are already saved. His eyes shifted to her hand. Where? In the document system. Victor looked at Claire. Claire said, standard procedure. He stepped back. Fine. Send your questions to finance. Annie, you will not access closed payroll periods again without written authorization. Why? Because I said so. Claire's voice stayed level. I supervise her. I run this project. And these are company records. Victor walked away without another word, but the speed of his steps made his anger clear. Annie sat down again. Did I go too far? Claire opened a blank email. You asked him where workers' money went. That isn't what I asked. I know. Annie looked toward Victor's office. He's going to find a way to make this my fault. Then we make sure the facts arrive first. They sent the records to corporate finance and copied Richard's legal compliance office. Claire instructed Annie to keep handwritten notes with dates and file numbers. At lunch, Annie carried her food box outside and sat with Daniel near the supply yard. Frank Delaney was eating from a paper bag at the next table. Annie hesitated before approaching him. "Mr. Delaney, can I ask you something about last week?" Frank folded the top of his bag. "Depends whether I'm in trouble." "No." "Did you work late Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday?" He laughed. "My knees remember every minute." "Were all your hours on your check?" His smile disappeared. "Why?" "Please check." Frank wiped his hands on his jeans. "My checks are direct deposit. I look at the total, not every line." "Will you look tonight?" Daniel watched them carefully. "What did you find?" Annie sat beside him. "Hours are being moved." "How many?" "At least 11 workers so far." Frank leaned closer. "Moved where?" "That's what we're trying to understand." He looked toward the project office. "I complained about a short check in March. Payroll told me my supervisor submitted the wrong code. Did they fix it?" "They added some on the next check. Not all." "Do you have the statements?" "At home." "Keep them." Frank's mouth tightened. "I'm 2 years from retirement, Annie. I'm not asking you to accuse anyone. You're asking me to start looking." "Yes." He stared at the paper bag in his hands. "Sometimes looking costs more than a man can afford," Daniel said. "So does pretending." Frank nodded slowly. "I'll bring the statements tomorrow." Later that afternoon, Annie moved to purchase records while Claire joined a conference call. The first invoices were ordinary. Concrete, lumber, gloves, safety glasses. Then she found repeated charges for fall protection harnesses. 300 new units had been billed over 4 months. Annie opened the warehouse inventory. Only 46 were listed. She checked the site issue log. Crews were still using old harnesses with faded tags. When Claire returned, Annie showed her. "Could the rest be stored somewhere else?" Annie asked. "Possibly. Can we check?" Claire glanced toward Victor's office. "We can." They walked to the supply yard and asked the warehouse clerk to show them the latest shipment. He led them past shelves of hard hats and rope to several boxes labeled with the supplier's name. Claire opened one. Inside were old harnesses. Some had frayed straps. Several metal clips had been repainted. New inspection labels had been attached over older ones. Annie lifted one carefully. "This isn't new." The clerk looked toward the door. "I only receive what they send." "Who told you to store these as new?" Claire asked. "I don't know." "You signed the receiving form." "I was told to." "By whom?" Before he could answer, Victor entered. He took in the open boxes, the harness in Annie's hand, and the phone Claire had raised to take photographs. "Put that down," he said. Annie did not move. "Workers are wearing these." "I said put it down." Claire photographed the torn strap. "Why were used harnesses recorded as new?" Victor looked at the warehouse clerk. "Leave us." The man left at once. Victor closed the distance between himself and Annie. "You are outside your assigned area. Claire brought me. I'm speaking to you." Annie placed the harness on the table. "Then answer me. Would you wear this 10 floors up?" Victor stared at her for a long moment. "That is enough for today," he said. "Go home." Annie looked at Claire. Claire shook her head. "She stays." Victor's face changed. The professional calm remained, but something underneath it had begun to show. "You both seem to have forgotten who controls this site." Annie glanced at the boxes filled with damaged equipment. "No," she said. "I think we're starting to understand." Victor left the warehouse without waiting for an answer. Claire remained beside the open boxes while Annie examined another harness. The webbing had been cleaned, but dirt remained inside the stitching. One metal hook carried a thin crack near the hinge. "Take pictures of every serial number," Claire said. Annie raised her phone. "He told us to leave. He also told the warehouse clerk to record used equipment as new." "You think the clerk will say that?" "Not while Victor controls his schedule." Annie photographed the boxes, labels, straps, and receiving forms. Claire copied the purchase order numbers into her tablet. They worked without speaking until the warehouse door opened again. A security supervisor stood outside. "Miss Monroe, Mr. Crane says this area is closed pending inventory review." Claire looked at the open boxes. "We are reviewing the inventory. He wants both of you back in the office." "Did he put that in writing?" The supervisor hesitated. "He gave me the instruction, then asked him to email it." The man looked toward Annie. "I'll need to check her bag before she leaves." Annie lowered her phone. "Why?" Standard site procedure. No one checked it when I came in. This is a restricted storage area. Claire stepped between them. Her phone contains company records collected under my supervision. You are not taking it. I didn't say I was taking anything. You said you wanted to search her bag after she found evidence of false inventory. The supervisor's face tightened. I'm doing my job. So are we. Annie picked up her food box and small canvas bag. He can look. Claire turned to her. You don't have to agree. I don't want Victor saying I stole something. The supervisor opened the bag on the warehouse table. Inside were Annie's notebook, work gloves, a pharmacy receipt, a bus pass, and a folded blouse from Rosie's Cafe. He moved each item aside, then opened the blue food box. 2 crackers and half an orange remained from lunch. That enough? Annie asked. The supervisor closed the box. You can go. She repacked the bag with slow hands. The inspection had taken less than a minute, but it left her feeling exposed in a way the heat and dust never had. Outside, Claire said, I'm reporting that. He'll call it procedure. Then I'll ask how many other employees had their lunch open today. Annie stopped walking. Don't make this bigger than it is. Claire faced her. Why are you protecting them? I'm protecting my job. By letting them create a record that says searching you is normal? If I complain about every little thing, they'll say I'm difficult. They may say it anyway. Annie looked toward the office trailer. You don't understand what it costs when people decide you're difficult. Claire's answer came more quietly. No, not the way you do. Back inside, Victor had called a meeting. Richard sat at the conference table with 2 corporate attorneys connected by video. Payroll reports and safety photographs filled the screen. Victor began before Annie and Claire had taken their seats. We have a serious concern regarding unauthorized access to closed payroll records and restricted inventory. Richard looked at Claire. Unauthorized? She was working under my direction. Victor tapped a folder. Annie's account accessed files outside her assigned period. Several records were changed last night. Annie felt the back of her neck grow cold. I didn't change anything. The system says otherwise. When? Between 9:12 and 9:46. I was at Rosie's Cafe. Victor leaned back. Your account was used. That isn't the same as me using it. One of the attorneys asked, does anyone else know your password? No. Did you write it down? In my notebook, but the notebook stayed in my bag. Victor said, the same bag she carried into the warehouse. Annie turned toward him. You just had security search it, which may have prevented further problems. Claire placed her tablet on the table. The changes came from a workstation inside the administrative suite. Victor's expression did not move. How do you know that? I requested the device log before you restricted access. Richard looked at the screen. Which workstation? Claire opened the report. Terminal A17. Victor said, that terminal is used by several assistants. It is assigned to your suite, Claire replied. That proves nothing. It proves Annie was not sitting at Rosie's Cafe and inside your office at the same time. The attorney asked Annie whether she could confirm her evening shift. Rosie has the time card. There are customers who saw me. Victor folded his hands. No one is accusing her of being in 2 places. Annie stared at him. You were doing exactly that 5 seconds ago. Richard raised a hand. Enough. He looked at Annie. Is there anything you want to tell us before the technology review begins? The question struck harder than Victor's accusation. Annie held his gaze. Would you ask him that first? Richard's expression changed. What? Would you look at Victor and ask if there's something he wants to admit? This meeting is about activity under your account. And the computer was in his office. Victor said, watch your tone. Annie turned toward him. My tone didn't move the files. Richard said her name, but she continued. Every time something is wrong, I'm the first person asked to explain myself. He gets to sit there and call it procedure. I have to prove I'm not a thief. No one called you a thief, the attorney said. You mentioned criminal access before checking where the computer was. The attorney became silent. Annie looked at Richard. He gets credibility from his title. I get suspicion from where I came from. Richard did not answer immediately. Claire broke the silence. The full device report will show which identification card opened the administrative suite and which user profile was active before Annie's credentials appeared. Victor turned sharply. I have authority to preserve evidence. You are turning a clerical error into an accusation against senior management. No, Claire said. Someone used Annie's identity after she found missing wages and false safety records. It became an accusation before we entered this room. Richard closed the folder in front of him. An outside firm reviews everything. No internal technology staff. No one reporting to Victor. And no records altered until the review is complete. Victor leaned forward. You're allowing a trainee to disrupt the entire project. I'm allowing evidence to be examined. And Annie? She keeps her position. Victor's face hardened. That is a mistake. Richard looked at him. Then the review will prove it. The meeting ended, but Annie remained seated. Richard waited until the others left. I almost failed you in there, he said. You did fail me. He accepted the correction. I thought I was asking a neutral question. There was nothing neutral about it. Richard nodded. I see that now. Annie stood. You see it because Claire found the computer. What would you see if she hadn't? He had no answer. That evening, Annie returned home after her shift at Rosie's. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with an old cardboard file box beside her. I heard someone called the cafe asking about you, Evelyn said. Rosie told me. They asked about your hours, your debts, and whether you ever take money from the register. Annie set down her bag. Who was it? They didn't leave a name. Evelyn placed both hands on the box. There's something you need to see. Inside were papers Annie had never seen. Old pay stubs, insurance letters, a photograph of damaged machinery, and a copy of a complaint written in her father's hand. Annie read the name printed at the top of the incident form. Crane Industrial Services. She looked at her mother. Evelyn's voice shook. That was the company running the site where your father died. Annie read the name again. Then she saw the signature authorizing the final report. Victor Crane. Annie kept reading until the words began to blur. The report described her father's death in language so clean it barely seemed connected to a person. Equipment failure had been ruled out. James Carter had allegedly ignored procedure, entered a restricted area, and placed himself beneath an unstable lifting platform. Annie read the final sentence twice. Employee error was the primary cause. That's not true, she said. Evelyn remained at the kitchen table. Your father said the lift had been acting up for weeks. Then why did you sign this? Annie regretted the question as soon as it left her mouth. Evelyn looked down at the settlement agreement. Because I had just buried my husband. Because men in suits came here and said the company could prove he caused it. Because the rent was due, you needed food. And I didn't know how to fight people who brought lawyers into my kitchen. I'm sorry. You don't owe me an apology. Annie lifted the photograph from the box. It showed a yellow lifting platform with one side lower than the other. A dark stain marked the metal near the base. Who took this? Your father. On the back, James had written a date and 4 words. Hydraulic pressure failing again. The date was 3 days before his death. Annie searched through the remaining papers. She found a maintenance request with James's signature, then another filed 2 weeks earlier. Both reported sudden drops, leaking fluid, and an emergency brake that did not always hold. The first request was stamped received. The second was marked no defect found. The final incident report carried Victor Crane's approval. Evelyn reached for a folded letter. He wrote this the night before the accident. I found it in his truck. Annie unfolded it carefully. If they send that lift up again, somebody is going to get hurt. Crane says we're behind and replacement parts can wait. I told Daniel Foster and put it in writing. If anything happens, make sure they don't say nobody warned them. Annie lowered the page. He knew. Your father knew it was dangerous, Evelyn said. No, Victor knew. Evelyn's face tightened. Maybe he signed what someone else gave him. He is doing the same thing now. Annie explained the damaged harnesses, false invoices, missing overtime, and altered computer records. Evelyn listened without interrupting. When Annie finished, her mother asked, What are you going to do? Take this to Richard. And if he protects the company, then I'll know what he is. The next morning, Annie arrived at Whitmore Commons before Claire. She carried the file box with both arms and went straight to Richard's temporary office. His assistant tried to stop her. He's on a call. He can finish it later. You need an appointment. Annie placed the file box on the assistant's desk. Tell him James Carter's daughter is here with the report Victor Crane signed after he died. The office door opened. Richard stood inside with his phone still in his hand. Come in. Annie carried the box to the conference table. Richard ended the call without explanation. She placed the photograph, maintenance requests, settlement agreement, and final report in front of him. My father worked for Crane Industrial Services 12 years ago. Richard looked at Victor's signature. What happened? A lift failed. My father died. The company said he ignored procedure. Richard read the handwritten complaint. Annie watched his face. Whitmore bought Crane Industrial 3 years later. 9 years ago. Richard corrected quietly. You remember the date. I approved the acquisition. Did you review the deaths too? Richard looked up. Not every individual claim. That isn't an answer. No, I did not review your father's case. Annie pushed the photograph toward him. His equipment failed. He reported it. Victor signed a report blaming him. Richard called Claire and asked her to come immediately. He also requested the acquisition archive and the legal files connected to Crane Industrial Services. Within 30 minutes, Claire entered with a corporate attorney on speakerphone. The attorney warned Richard against discussing responsibility before verifying the records. Annie looked at the phone. My father had to prove he followed procedure after he was dead. Victor gets a lawyer before anyone even asks him a question. Richard turned off the speaker. The attorney's voice vanished in the middle of a sentence. Claire, Richard said, find everything. Victor entered without knocking. I heard there's a meeting about my former company. Annie faced him. You signed the report that blamed my father. Victor glanced at the papers. James Carter. The ease with which he remembered the name made Annie's stomach tighten. You remember him. I remember the incident. You remember his warnings? I remember a tragic accident. He wrote that you refused to replace the lift. Victor picked up the maintenance request. Workers write complaints every day. Most equipment concerns turn out to be minor. He died the next morning, and investigators concluded he entered a restricted zone. My father was sent there. According to whom? According to him. Victor put down the page. A handwritten note is not an investigation. Annie stepped closer to the table. Neither is a report signed by the man protecting the schedule. Richard told Victor to leave. Victor remained still. You need to understand what reopening this means. Crane Industrial handled hundreds of projects. If one settlement is challenged, every closed claim becomes vulnerable. Leave, Richard repeated. Victor looked at Annie before walking out. By afternoon, Claire had located the acquisition files. Whitmore Development had purchased Crane Industrial, absorbed its contracts, and transferred older liabilities into an inactive subsidiary. A legal memorandum recommended closing unresolved worker claims unless new evidence created significant exposure. Victor had written the recommendation. Richard had signed the acquisition approval. Annie placed her finger on Richard's signature. You signed this. I signed the purchase. I didn't see your father's file. You bought the profit and left the dead man in a cabinet. Richard flinched but did not argue. Claire opened another document. There's more. Victor recommended final closure of the Carter claim 8 months after the acquisition. He wrote that further review had no financial justification. Annie read the sentence. No financial justification. Her father's name appeared below it, reduced to a claim number and a reserve amount. Richard stood near the window. I'll bring in an outside investigator. When? Today. And the records? They'll be preserved. Will you release them? Not until the investigation confirms what happened. Annie stared at him. You already have his complaint. We need the full record. My father gave the full record before he died. Richard's voice remained controlled. I'm not refusing. You're waiting. I'm trying to make sure the truth holds up. Delay always helps the person who already has power. Richard said nothing. Annie gathered the papers, leaving copies with Claire. As she reached the door, Richard spoke. I did not know your father's name. She turned. He continued. That does not mean I am innocent of forgetting men like him existed. For the first time that morning, Annie heard no defense in his voice. But honesty did not answer the question she still carried. Then decide whether remembering him costs too much. She returned to her desk and searched the archive safety database using James Carter's incident number. One hidden attachment appeared beneath the final report. It was an email her father had sent 3 days before his death. Annie opened it. The message listed 2 other sites using the same lifting equipment. At the bottom, James had written one final warning. Someone will die if they keep calling this a delay instead of a danger. Annie read the sentence, then looked through the office window toward the eastern scaffolding. Workers were already climbing. Annie left her desk and crossed the yard toward the eastern scaffolding. The morning crew was already carrying tools onto the lower platforms. Several men clipped their harnesses to a horizontal line that sagged between two anchors. Daniel saw her coming and stepped away from a stack of steel braces. What happened? She handed him a printed copy of her father's email. Read the last line. Daniel scanned it, then looked toward the structure. Same pattern? Complaints marked complete. Repairs delayed. Old equipment recorded as new. Daniel folded the page. I submitted 2 requests on that scaffold. When? Last week, and again Monday. What was wrong? The ground settled near the east corner. 2 base plates shifted. We added temporary support and stopped work above level 6. Annie looked up. Men were moving along the 8th level. They're higher than 6. I know. Daniel called a foreman over. Who cleared the upper platforms? Victor's office sent a revised order this morning. Did you see the inspection report? The schedule said approved. Daniel took the radio from his belt. Get everyone above level 6 down. The foreman hesitated. Victor said we lose the whole morning if we stop. Then we lose the morning. Annie walked closer to the scaffold base. One steel plate no longer sat flat against the ground. A gap had opened beneath one edge, filled with crushed stone and dust. A timber brace had been wedged against it as a temporary fix. She crouched and photographed it. Daniel spoke into the radio. Eastern elevation. Stop work above level 6. Bring the crew down now. A voice answered through static. Copy. Within minutes, workers began descending. Victor arrived before the last man reached the ground. What are you doing? He asked Daniel. Closing the upper section. On whose authority? Mine. Victor pointed toward the scaffold. An engineer cleared it. Show me the report. It's in the office. Then work stays stopped until I read it. Victor turned to Annie. You again. She stood. The base plate moved. You are not qualified to inspect scaffolding. I'm qualified to see daylight under steel. Daniel held out his hand. Give me the report. Victor ignored him. This section is already 3 days behind. The workers go back up. No, Daniel said. Victor moved closer. You report to me. I report unsafe conditions too. Several workers remain nearby, listening. Victor lowered his voice. Do you want to discuss your position in front of the crew? Daniel answered just as quietly. Do you want to explain why you're sending them onto a structure you won't stand under? Victor's face tightened. Annie said, the harness invoices are false. The inspection tags are false. Now there's a report no one can produce. Victor turned toward her. You have been in that office for less than a month. You do not understand how large projects operate. I understand that people are up there while you look for paperwork. Richard's SUV entered the yard before Victor could answer. He stepped out with Claire and an outside safety consultant. Richard had requested the inspection after reviewing Annie's records, but the consultant was not expected until later that morning. Victor walked toward them. We have a minor disagreement, Daniel said. Work was ordered above a restricted level. Richard looked at the scaffold. Who approved it? Victor answered. The site engineer. Name? Paul Mercer. Claire checked her tablet. Mercer is in Savannah today. Victor paused. He reviewed the photographs last night. Then where is the written approval? Richard asked. It may not have uploaded yet. Annie handed Richard the photographs she had taken at the base. Daniel submitted 2 repair requests. Both are marked complete. The consultant examined the plate and timber support. This isn't complete, he said. This is temporary stabilization. Is the scaffold safe? Richard asked. Not above the restricted level. I need to inspect the anchors and load distribution before anyone returns. Richard faced Victor. The eastern section stays closed. Victor kept his voice calm. A shutdown will delay exterior work by at least a week. Then it is delayed. The lenders are already questioning the schedule. Richard looked toward the workers gathered beside the structure. They can question me. Victor walked away without another word. The consultant began his inspection while Annie and Claire returned to the office. By noon, the preliminary findings confirmed uneven support, loose connections, and damaged fall protection equipment. Claire placed the report on Richard's desk. This is enough to contact the safety authorities. Richard read the first page. The outside audit starts tomorrow. That is not the same thing. It preserves the records and gives us verified findings. Annie stood near the door. Why not stop the whole site? because the problems may be limited to one section. The payroll was not limited to one section. The harnesses were not limited to one crew, Claire added. Richard looked between them. A full shutdown affects hundreds of workers. So does pretending the rest of the site is safe, Annie said. I'm not pretending. You're waiting again. Richard closed the report. I need facts strong enough that Victor cannot challenge them. Annie replied. The workers need equipment strong enough that they don't have to trust him. Richard's jaw tightened. I ordered the dangerous section closed, and he opened it before you arrived. That ended the discussion. Later, Annie ate lunch with Daniel and several workers beside the storage yard. Frank Delaney brought copies of his pay statements. They shorted me 27 hours since March, he said. Luis Ortega placed his own records on the table. They took 12 from me last month. Another worker, Curtis Hale, shook his head. I complained once. My Saturday shifts disappeared. Annie organized the statements by date and approval code. Frank looked around before speaking. What happens if we sign something? You may be asked questions, Annie said. Victor may try to make you regret it. I'm 2 years from retirement. I know. I lose this job. I lose the health plan. Daniel said, no one signs today unless they're ready. Frank studied his statements. At my age, courage gets expensive. Annie looked at the missing hours. So does silence. Frank signed his name. By the end of lunch, 6 workers had signed written statements. That evening, Annie left the office after sunset. A photograph was tucked beneath the windshield wiper of her car. It showed Evelyn leaving the clinic. No message was written on it. Annie stood beside the car, holding the photograph by its edges. Claire came through the gate and saw her face. What is it? Annie handed it over. Claire examined the image. When was this taken? This morning. She had blood work. Did anyone follow her home? I don't know. Claire called Richard and advised Annie to contact the police. The responding officer arrived 20 minutes later. He looked at the photograph, then at Annie. Could be someone from the clinic. Why would a clinic employee leave this on my car? Maybe a coworker is trying to scare you. That's what I'm reporting. Has anyone made a direct threat? No. Then there isn't much we can do. Annie asked him to file the report anyway. After he left, Claire scanned the photograph and sealed the original in an envelope. You should stay home tomorrow, she said. No. Annie, if I stay home, Victor learns this works. The next morning, a warehouse clerk named Tomas found Annie near the copy room. He kept his voice low. They're moving the old harnesses tonight. Who told you? Victor. Where? I don't know. He said a truck comes after 10. Will you say that to Claire? Tomas glanced toward Victor's office. He knows my work papers are being renewed. Annie understood. You don't have to sign anything yet. Send me the truck number when it arrives. That night, Annie and Daniel returned to the site. A box truck waited beside the warehouse with its rear doors open. Workers were loading the damaged equipment. Daniel parked his pickup across the exit. Victor stepped from the warehouse. You have no authority to block that truck. Daniel turned off the engine. Where's it going? For disposal. Annie approached the open doors and picked up one harness. A fresh inspection label covered an older tag. This says it passed yesterday. Victor said, put it back. She photographed the label. Victor stepped closer. You keep forgetting where you came from. Annie lowered the phone. No. That's why I know what your decisions cost. Behind him, the truck driver quietly shut off the engine. The damaged equipment was no longer leaving unnoticed. The box truck remained blocked at the warehouse exit while Daniel stood beside his pickup and Victor spoke into his phone. Annie stayed near the open rear doors, photographing every harness and inspection label before anyone could move them. You're interfering with company property, Victor said. Daniel folded his arms. Then call Richard. I already did. Good. Victor ended the call. He's in New York. He doesn't have time for this. Annie held up a harness with a torn strap. He should make time. Victor turned to the driver. Back the truck toward the loading bay. The driver looked at Daniel's pickup, then at Victor. There isn't enough room. Then wait, Daniel said. No one moves anything until the equipment is logged. Victor stepped closer to him. You are one instruction away from losing your position. Daniel did not raise his voice. Then give the instruction where everyone can hear it. The warehouse workers stopped loading. Tomas stood near the doorway. keeping his eyes on the floor. Claire arrived 10 minutes later with a security manager and a legal compliance officer. She ordered the truck sealed and the driver's documents copied. Victor protested until Claire showed him the email Richard had sent from the airport. All safety equipment involved in the disputed invoices was to remain on site pending an independent audit. Victor read the message and handed back the phone. "This is unnecessary," Claire replied. "Then the audit will be short." By the following morning, the damaged harnesses were stored in a locked container. The eastern scaffold remained closed above level 6. An outside inspection team was scheduled to arrive at 8. Annie reached the site before sunrise. She noticed movement along the eastern side before she reached the office. Several workers were already climbing past the red restriction tape. Daniel came across the yard, fastening his hard hat. "I didn't clear them." "Who did?" He handed her a printed work order. Victor distributed this at 5:30. The document authorized limited access through level 9. Richard's digital signature appeared at the bottom. Annie read it twice. "Did Richard send this?" "Claire is checking." A foreman called down from the scaffold. "Daniel, are we working or not? Stay where you are until I confirm the order." Victor walked out of the project trailer holding a coffee cup. "The order is confirmed," he said. Daniel held up the page. "Richard signed this?" "Yes." "Claire didn't receive it. Richard doesn't need Claire's permission." Annie moved closer. "The inspector isn't here yet." Victor took a drink of coffee. The overnight engineer reviewed the support repairs. "What engineer?" "Mercer. He was in Savannah yesterday." He returned. Daniel reached for his radio. "I want him here before anyone goes higher." Victor's patience ended. "You don't set the schedule anymore." Daniel looked at him. "Since when?" "Since you began taking instructions from a trainee." Annie said, "Call Richard." Victor ignored her. Daniel spoke into the radio. "All Eastern crews, come down." Victor grabbed the radio from his hand. "Continue work," he said. "The order is valid." Men on the lower platforms stopped and looked down. Annie pulled out her phone and called Claire. Claire answered after the second ring. "Tell me Richard approved work on the eastern scaffold." "He did not. His signature is on the order." "Send me a photograph." Annie sent it. Claire called back less than a minute later. "It's copied from an older authorization. Richard is boarding a flight. I'm getting him now." Victor walked toward Annie. "Put the phone away." "No. You no longer have authority over field operations." "I never said I did." "Then stop giving orders." "I'm asking why you forged one." Workers nearby heard her. Victor's face remained calm, but his voice dropped. "Be careful." Daniel stepped between them. "She asked a fair question." Victor looked past him. "You are both finished here if this crew loses another morning." Annie pointed toward the scaffold. "That corner moved yesterday. It was reinforced with temporary timber. It passed review. Show us the report." Victor looked at the workers above. "Keep moving." Daniel reached for his radio again, but 2 security officers approached from the trailer. Victor said, "Remove Annie from the active site." One officer hesitated. "On what grounds?" "She is disrupting operations." Annie looked toward the men on the scaffold. "Ask them to come down first." Victor raised his voice. "This is no longer your concern. It became my concern when you sent people up there." The workers began descending on their own. Victor watched the first man step onto the ground. "Anyone who leaves position without authorization loses the day's pay." The man stopped. Daniel's expression hardened. "You threaten their wages again. I'll put it in writing." Victor pointed at him. "You're suspended." Several workers began speaking at once. Annie called Richard directly. The call connected through Claire. Richard's voice came through the speaker. "What is happening?" Victor answered before Annie could. "A minor work dispute. Daniel is refusing a valid schedule." Claire said, "The signature is not valid." Richard's tone changed. "Victor, clear the scaffold." Victor looked around at the workers listening. "Richard, we're already behind. The lenders are meeting this afternoon. Clear it. The inspector has not found a failure. The inspector has not arrived." Victor moved away from the phone. "You're making a decision based on fear." Annie stepped closer so Richard could hear her. The base shifted. The harnesses were falsified. Daniel's repair requests were closed without the work being done. Richard said, "No one goes back up." Annie asked, "Are you closing the entire site?" A pause followed. Richard replied. The Eastern section. The false records aren't limited to one section. Annie, I need verified findings before I stop work for 200 people. The findings keep arriving after someone gets hurt. Victor watched her, almost satisfied. Richard said, I'm doing what I can from here. That's the problem, Annie replied. You keep doing what you can afford. Claire spoke her name, but Annie continued. Did you give me a seat at the table so I could speak, or only so I could be grateful? Richard's voice became quieter. That isn't fair. It isn't dangerous for you. The call ended several minutes later with the Eastern section closed and the rest of the project still operating. Annie walked back to the office. Victor followed her inside and shut the door behind them. He placed an envelope on her desk. What is that? A permanent administrative position, tuition assistance, full medical coverage for your mother, a salary higher than Claire offered. Annie did not touch it. What do you want? You resign from the trainee program today. You sign a confidentiality agreement. You stop asking questions about payroll, equipment, and your father. Annie looked at him. You want to buy my silence. I'm offering you a future. My father had one too. Victor's mouth tightened. Your father made mistakes. Annie pushed the envelope back. My father's name is not for sale either. You walk away from this, and your mother loses the medical support. The clinic care is separate from my job. Contracts change. Annie understood then that Victor had never believed Richard's promises mattered more than his own control. She removed her temporary badge and placed it on the desk. Victor looked at it. What are you doing? Leaving before this place teaches me to call fear a policy. She gathered her notebook and blue food box. Claire found her near the exit. Don't resign. I already did. Richard is ordering a full review tomorrow. Tomorrow. He's preparing to shut down the project. He had the chance this morning. Claire lowered her voice. Leaving gives Victor what he wants. No, staying quiet would. Annie walked out. The next morning, she was pouring coffee at Rosie's when her phone vibrated. The message came from Tomas. Crews are back on the east scaffold. Victor says they need one last load moved before shutdown. Annie called Daniel. Wind filled the line. I'm trying to get them down, he said. Victor brought in another supervisor. A metallic crack sounded behind him. Daniel, stay away from here. The call ended. Annie left the coffee pot on the counter and ran outside. By the time she reached Whitmore Commons, the wind had strengthened. Workers were carrying steel frames across the upper platforms. Daniel was climbing toward them. Victor stood below, shouting at the crane operator to keep moving. Annie saw the eastern base plate lift from the ground. Get them down, she shouted. Victor turned toward her. A connection near the 6th level snapped. The sound was small, almost lost beneath the engines. Then the entire scaffold shifted away from the building. The eastern scaffold pulled away from the building with a groan of bending steel. Workers on the upper levels grabbed rails and braces as the platforms tilted beneath them. A bundle of metal frames swung from the crane line and struck the side of the structure, sending boards and tools into the yard. Everybody down, Daniel shouted from the 6th level. Annie ran toward the emergency lane, waving both arms at a concrete truck entering through the gate. Stop. Back out. Keep the lane clear. The driver hit the brakes. Behind him, workers scattered as another section of scaffold twisted and dropped onto the lower platforms. Victor stood near the crane operator, shouting into a radio. Lower the load. Lower it now. The line's caught, the operator answered. Cut it loose. No, Annie yelled. It'll fall across the exit. Victor turned toward her. Get off the site. A young worker hung several feet above the ground, suspended by a harness attached to a bent rail. One strap had begun to separate near his shoulder. Help me, he cried. Annie ran beneath him and looked for a safe approach. The damaged scaffold shifted each time the wind struck it. She saw a maintenance ladder leading to a lower concrete landing. Don't move, she called. Keep both hands on the line. I can't hold much longer. You don't have to. I'm coming up. A foreman caught Annie's arm. That platform isn't stable. The landing is concrete. You don't have a harness. There's a rescue line in the emergency cabinet. The foreman opened the cabinet while Annie pointed toward 2 workers nearby. You, bring the rope. You, call 911 and tell them we have multiple people trapped on the east side. The first worker handed her the line. Annie looped it around a fixed support and tested the knot. Daniel's voice came over a radio lying in the dust. "Lower level, answer me." Annie grabbed it. "Daniel, where are you?" "Between 5 and 6. Beam came down across my leg." "Can you move?" "No." "Anyone with you?" "Curtis and Luis are above me. They're conscious." Annie looked up. She could not see him through the dust and twisted frames. "Stay on the radio." "Annie, don't climb. I'm not coming to you yet. You shouldn't be here at all. You can lecture me after they get you out." Sirens sounded beyond the highway. Annie climbed the maintenance ladder to the concrete landing. The suspended worker was less than 6 feet away, but a gap separated them. The foreman climbed behind her with the rescue line. "What's his name?" Annie asked. "Marcus Hill." "Marcus, listen to me," she called. "We're going to connect a second line to your belt. Don't reach until I tell you." His breathing came fast, the straps tearing. "I see it. Keep your weight still." The foreman secured himself to the concrete anchor and moved close enough to throw the line. Marcus missed it the first time. "Again," Annie said. "Look at me, not the ground." Marcus raised his head. "That's it, catch with your left hand." The second throw reached him. He wrapped the rope around his wrist, and the foreman pulled until the hook came within reach. "Clip it to the metal ring at your waist," Annie said. "My hands are shaking." "Then use both. We're holding the line." A section of railing dropped from above and struck the landing. Annie turned, but the end of the metal bar hit her shoulder and drove her against the wall. Pain moved down her arm. The foreman grabbed her. "Are you hurt?" "I can stand." Blood ran from a cut near her temple. "Annie, go down." "Not until he's connected." Marcus secured the hook seconds before the damaged strap tore. The rescue rope caught his weight. He swung toward the wall, and the foreman pulled him onto the landing. Firefighters reached them as Annie's knees weakened. One firefighter examined her shoulder. "You need to come down now." Daniel Brooks is trapped between levels 5 and 6. 2 more workers are above him. Use the west service stairs. The eastern access is blocked. "How do you know?" "I cleared that route last month." The firefighter spoke into his radio and redirected the rescue team. Annie descended with help. Ambulances filled the lane. Workers sat on the ground while medics checked cuts, fractures, and breathing problems. Richard's SUV stopped beyond the emergency vehicles. He got out before the driver could open his door. "What happened?" he asked Claire, who had arrived minutes earlier. "Victor reopened the scaffold. I closed it." He used a copied authorization. Richard saw Annie near the ambulance, one arm held close to her body and blood on the side of her face. He crossed the yard. "Why are you here?" She looked at him as though the question made no sense. "People were still up there." "You're injured." "Daniel is trapped." Richard turned toward the structure. Firefighters were cutting through a bent brace near the 5th level. Victor came from the project trailer carrying 2 file boxes. Richard blocked his path. "Where are you taking those?" "Protecting records from the weather." "Put them down." "These are operational files." "Put them down." Victor looked toward the reporters gathering outside the gate. "You need to be careful. One wrong statement and they'll blame the entire company before we know what happened. We know you reopened a closed scaffold. I had an engineer's approval. Then show it to investigators." Victor moved around him. Claire stepped in front of the vehicle and raised her phone, photographing the boxes and license plate. "No records leave," she said. Victor's face tightened. "Move your car." "No." Richard called the security manager. "Seal the project office. No document, computer, or equipment leaves without a written log." Victor stared at him. "You're destroying your own company." Richard looked toward the injured workers. "If the truth destroys it, then it should answer for what it became." A rescue crew brought Daniel down on a stretcher. His face had lost color, but he was conscious. Annie moved toward him. He saw the blood on her forehead. "I told you to stay away." "You're welcome." Daniel tried to smile, then closed his eyes as paramedics loaded him into the ambulance. Richard faced the workers and reporters gathering near the gate. His attorneys were calling. Claire showed him the screen, but he declined the calls. A reporter shouted, "Mr. Whitmore, did your company ignore safety warnings?" Richard stepped toward the cameras. Victor said quietly, "Do not answer that." Richard looked at Annie. She stood beside the ambulance with dust covering her clothes, and one hand pressed against her injured shoulder. He turned back to the cameras. "Yes," he said. "Warnings were made. We did not act quickly enough." Victor walked toward the trailer while attention shifted to Richard. He entered through the side door, opened a locked cabinet, and removed a portable hard drive. Outside, Richard continued speaking. The site is closed effective immediately. All workers will be paid during the investigation. Every record will be released to independent authorities. Annie saw Victor through the office window. She tried to call Claire, but the yard moved out of focus. "Victor," she managed to say, then her legs gave way, and a medic caught her before she reached the ground. By the time Claire understood what Annie had seen, Victor's truck was already leaving through the service gate. The hard drive containing the payroll files, safety reports, and James Carter's original case was gone. Annie woke to the sound of a blood pressure cuff tightening around her arm. Her shoulder had been secured in a sling, and 6 stitches pulled at the skin near her temple whenever she moved her face. Evelyn sat beside the bed with the blue food box on her lap. "You brought it," Annie said. "Daniel asked a paramedic to get it from your locker before they sealed the site." "How is he?" "Out of surgery. His leg is badly injured, but the doctor says he should recover." Annie closed her eyes for a moment. "The others?" "2 serious injuries. No one died." The relief came slowly. It did not erase what had happened, but it gave her room to breathe. Evelyn placed the food box on the chair. "Richard Whitmore has been waiting outside for nearly an hour. I don't want to see him. He says he released the records. The hard drive is gone. Claire saved copies of some files. Some isn't enough." Evelyn adjusted the blanket near Annie's feet. "Then make him explain what he plans to do about the rest." Richard entered only after Annie agreed. He had changed his shirt, but concrete dust remained along the cuffs of his trousers. He stopped near the door instead of approaching the bed. "How are you feeling?" "Like part of the scaffold landed on me." He accepted the answer. "The doctors say your shoulder will heal without surgery." "What about Daniel?" "He is stable." "And Victor?" "Missing." "You let him leave." "I did." Annie looked at him. "You were speaking to cameras while he walked out with the evidence." "Yes." Richard did not add an excuse. He pulled a chair closer but waited before sitting. "The board placed me on temporary leave. The lenders suspended funding. Federal safety investigators have taken control of the site. Claire preserved the payroll records, photographs, device logs, and recent safety reports. But not my father's original file. No. That was on the drive. Then Victor still has the one thing that proves he lied 12 years ago. We have copies of parts of it. Parts can be called incomplete." "I know." Annie shifted and pain moved through her shoulder. "You always know after." Richard looked down at his hands. "Yes." The answer removed some of her anger's direction without reducing it. He continued, "I made a public statement this morning. I confirmed that you and Daniel reported the scaffold. I confirmed that Victor reopened it without valid approval." "Did your lawyers write it?" "They advised me not to make it." "That wasn't what I asked." "No. I wrote it." Annie studied him. "And the company? The board wants to say Victor acted alone." "Did he?" "No." Richard's voice remained steady. "He signed the orders. He altered the reports. But I built a company where delay was punished faster than danger. I rewarded people for finishing early, and rarely asked what it cost them." Evelyn spoke from beside the window. "Admitting that does not repair anyone's bones." "No, ma'am." "Or return my husband." "No." Richard did not ask for forgiveness. He reached into a folder and handed Annie a printed document. It was an order preserving all company records and authorizing an outside review of every injury connected to Crane Industrial Services. Annie read the first page. "Why now?" "Because I waited too long yesterday." "You waited years before that." "I know." She placed the order on the bed. "Justice delayed isn't always justice denied. Sometimes it's justice injured." Richard nodded once. "I will remember that." Claire entered carrying a laptop and a paper cup of coffee. Her voice was rough from smoke and fatigue. "You should be in a bed too," Annie said. "I was examined. I'm fine." "You were near the office when it started?" Claire set the laptop on the tray table. "I went back after the collapse to secure the remaining backups. Victor had already removed the central drive, but he missed the external archive." She opened several folders. The files included payroll adjustments, photographs of the harnesses, work orders, and copies of James Carter's maintenance complaints. Annie leaned closer. "This is enough to reopen his case." "Enough to begin," Claire said. "Not enough to prove who altered the final report." Richard asked, "What about the server logs?" The original authorization files were stored on the drive Victor took. Annie looked at Claire. Then we find him. The police are searching. Victor knows the company's properties, storage sites, and vacant buildings better than they do. Claire hesitated. There is one more problem. She opened a list of archived locations. The paper files from old acquisitions are stored beneath the project office. Crane Industrial's records are still there. Richard's face changed. Why weren't they removed after the collapse? The records room is fire-rated. Investigators sealed the site before we could transfer anything. Annie understood at once. Victor will go back. Richard stood. I'll call the detective. Claire's phone rang before he reached the door. She answered and listened. What do you mean the cameras went offline? Annie watched her. Claire ended the call. The site lost power for 3 minutes. Backup cameras are working now, but the service gate was opened during the outage. Richard called security. Annie tried to sit higher, ignoring the pain in her shoulder. He's inside. Evelyn placed a hand on her arm. You are not leaving this hospital. I didn't say I was. You were thinking it. Richard spoke into his phone, ordering officers sent to Whitmore Commons. Claire checked the camera feed on her laptop. Most of the yard appeared empty. Rain struck the lenses, turning the lights into blurred shapes. Then one image cleared. A man crossed between the storage containers carrying a fuel can. Claire enlarged the frame. Victor. Richard stared at the screen. He's going to burn the archive. Claire was already packing the laptop. The records room has a suppression system. Unless he disables it, Annie said. Richard headed for the door. Stay here, he told Annie. She looked at the live image of Victor entering the project trailer. You said that before, she replied. People still went up the scaffold. 20 minutes later, while Richard and Claire drove toward the site, Annie's phone received a message from Claire. He locked me inside. Smoke coming through the door. Annie showed Evelyn. Her mother read it and closed her eyes. No, Evelyn said. Claire stayed when she could have walked away. You can barely lift your arm. I know the building. Let the police handle it. They don't know the service corridor. They don't know where the manual water valve is. Evelyn's hand remained on Annie's wrist. Do not go there for revenge. Annie looked at the photograph of her father's damaged machine on the bedside table, then at Claire's message. I'm not going for Victor. Then why? Because someone is still inside. Evelyn slowly released her. Annie took the blue food box from the chair, placed Claire's backup drive inside it, and closed the lid before leaving the hospital. Rain struck the windshield as Annie drove Rosie's old pickup toward Whitmore Commons. Her left arm remained secured in the sling, and every turn of the wheel sent pain through her shoulder. She kept the blue food box on the passenger seat with Claire's backup drive inside. The main road to the project was blocked by emergency vehicles, so Annie turned onto the service road used by delivery trucks. Water had begun collecting in the ruts. Ahead, the unfinished tower rose behind the fence, dark except for a few emergency lights. Richard's SUV stood near the open gate. He was speaking with a detective when Annie pulled in. He crossed the yard before she had fully stepped from the truck. What are you doing here? Where's Claire? Inside the records room. Victor locked her in. Then why are you standing out here? The trailer is burning. We're waiting for the fire department. Annie looked toward the project office. Smoke slipped from the roof vents and gathered beneath the rain. The records room has a fire door, she said. But if the ventilation shuts down, she won't have much air. The police won't let anyone enter. The detective approached. Miss Carter, you should return to the hospital. There's a maintenance corridor behind the storage yard. We searched the plans. It isn't on the current plans. They covered part of it when they added the new trailer. Richard looked at her. Where does it lead? To the utility wall behind the records room. The detective shook his head. Even if it's open, we don't know what condition it's in. I do. You were injured this morning. Claire is breathing smoke now. A security officer called from the gate. Fire department is 6 minutes out. Annie pointed toward the side of the trailer. She may not have 6. Richard turned to the detective. Let her show us the entrance. I'm not sending an injured civilian into a fire. She doesn't have to go inside, Richard said. She can guide us. The detective hesitated, then nodded. Show me. Annie led them past stacks of wet lumber and a row of storage containers. The rain had softened the ground, forcing them to move slowly. Behind an old generator enclosure, she found a sheet metal panel secured with 3 bolts. This used to be an access opening, she said. Daniel had us clear around it 2 months ago. Richard used a wrench from the emergency kit to loosen the first bolt. The detective removed the others. Together, they pulled the panel aside. A narrow concrete passage ran beneath the trailer. Smoke drifted through it. The detective switched on his flashlight. "Stay here. The manual suppression valve is 20 feet in," Annie said. "Left side, behind the pipe marked red." Richard looked at her. "How do you know that?" "I spent a week clearing this corridor." The detective and a security officer entered. Richard followed. Annie caught his sleeve with her good hand. "The floor drops near the second support post." He nodded and disappeared into the passage. Annie stood outside with the rain running down her face. Through the smoke, she heard coughing, then the detective's voice. "Found the valve. Metal scraped against metal." "It won't turn," Richard called. Annie stepped toward the opening. "Use the extension bar from the emergency cabinet." "There isn't one here." "The pipe section on the right wall. It's loose." Richard found it and slid it over the valve handle. A moment later, pipes shuddered above them. Water began striking the trailer roof and walls from the internal sprinklers. The smoke thinned near the vents. A security officer shouted, "We have a door." Annie heard repeated blows against metal. On the fourth strike, something broke. Claire coughed from inside. Richard emerged first, supporting her under one arm while the detective held the other. Soot covered her face. Her eyes watered, but she remained conscious. Annie moved toward her. Claire tried to speak, then coughed again. "Save your breath," Annie said. Claire caught her wrist. "Victor has the Carter file." "Where did he go?" "Main tower." He took the drive and a black document case. Paramedics reached them and placed an oxygen mask over Claire's face. Richard looked toward the unfinished building. "Why would he go up there?" Claire pulled the mask aside. "Crane controls." "He opened the auxiliary system." The detective frowned. "What does that mean?" Annie turned toward the tower crane. Its warning light blinked through the rain. "He's trying to move something." A cable above the storage yard began to tighten. Near the upper floors, a maintenance platform shifted from the side of the building. Richard called site security. "Shut down power to the crane." "The main power is already off," a voice answered through the radio. "He's running the backup generator." Annie looked at the temporary site maps posted beside the trailer. The crane's auxiliary controls could be reached from an upper mechanical level. Victor might use the hoist to lower the evidence beyond the police line, where someone could collect it from the service road, or he might destroy it from above. The detective ordered officers toward the tower entrance. Annie opened the blue food box and handed Claire the backup drive. "Keep this with you." Claire closed her fingers around it. "You came here carrying evidence in a lunchbox?" "No one ever thinks it matters." Richard moved toward the tower. Annie called after him. "The east stairwell is blocked above level 7. He stopped. "Use the west stairs until level 9, she said. "Then cross through the mechanical floor. Don't use the temporary elevator. You're staying here. I can guide you from the control trailer." The detective handed Annie a radio and followed Richard inside. Annie entered the security office. Several camera feeds remained dark, but one showed the upper floors. Rain moved through the open structure, and the image shook in the wind. She switched channels. "Richard, can you hear me?" "Yes." "Stay on the west side. Victor may be heading toward the restricted scaffold." Claire was taken toward an ambulance, but she turned back long enough to call out. He said Richard would have to choose between the company and the truth. Annie watched the monitors. A figure appeared on the 9th floor carrying a black case. Victor moved toward the eastern edge, where the repaired scaffold still hung beside the building. The crane cable shifted above him. Annie pressed the radio button. "He's on level 9, east side." Richard's breathing came through the speaker as he climbed. "We're almost there. Slow down near the opening." The temporary wall was removed. A second camera flickered to life. Victor stepped onto the restricted platform with the document case in one hand and the hard drive secured inside a tool bag. The scaffold moved beneath his weight. Annie felt her stomach tighten. "Richard," she said. "He's going on to the section that failed." A burst of static answered. Then Victor's voice came through the site's public address system. "You wanted the truth, Whitmore? Come up and watch it disappear." Annie looked at the swaying platform on the screen. Richard had reached the 9th floor. Only an unfinished section of concrete and steel remained between him, Victor, and the evidence that had survived 12 years of silence. Richard stepped onto the 9th floor and stopped near the open eastern wall. Rain blew across the concrete, carrying dust and loose paper toward the edge. Beyond the columns, Victor stood on the restricted scaffold with the black document case at his feet and the tool bag strapped across his shoulder. The platform shifted beneath him. "Don't come any closer," Victor called. Richard remained near the last concrete column. "Give me the drive." Victor laughed. "You still think this is about a drive? It is evidence. It is your company." Annie heard them through the radio in the security office. One camera showed Richard from behind. Another caught Victor from the side. Though rain blurred the image each time the wind moved the lens. The detective reached the 9th floor and stayed behind a concrete barrier. "Victor Crane," he shouted, "step off the scaffold and keep your hands where I can see them." Victor looked toward him. "You don't understand what you're arresting. I understand you locked a woman inside a burning office. I was protecting records from people who wanted to distort them." Claire's voice came through Annie's radio from the ambulance. "He tried to burn the records." Annie pressed the transmit button. "Richard, don't argue with him. Keep him talking until the officers reach the west side." Victor's voice came over the public address speakers. "I can hear you, Annie." She looked toward the microphone in the security office. "Then hear this clearly. Put the case down and step back inside. You have caused enough damage. The scaffold collapsed because you opened it. Workers ignored instructions. Daniel tried to stop them. Daniel forgot who paid him." Annie's jaw tightened. "That is all people are to you, isn't it? Names on payroll until they slow you down." Victor lifted the black case. "Every successful building has something buried under it." Richard answered at once. "Not people." Victor looked at him. "You think standing beside them now makes you different from me?" "No." The answer caught Victor off guard. Richard continued. "I signed budgets that rewarded speed. I accepted reports because they protected schedules. I let men like you tell me delay was more dangerous than harm." Victor smiled again. "There it is. You knew. I knew enough to ask better questions, and I chose not to. Then save yourself." Victor opened the document case. Wet papers shifted inside. "Walk away," he said. "I destroy this, you blame me. And the board puts you back in your office before Christmas." Richard took one step forward. The scaffold moved. Annie grabbed the radio. "Stop. The outer anchor is pulling." Richard looked toward the connection point. A bolt had begun to slide from the wall bracket. Victor noticed it too. He lowered the case. "Tell them to back off." The detective raised both hands. "No one is moving. Come inside." Victor looked down toward the yard. Emergency lights flashed below. Workers, police officers, and reporters had gathered beyond the perimeter. "There's no inside for me now," he said. He reached into the case and pulled out a bundle of files held together with a red band. Annie recognized the faded Crane Industrial logo on the first page. Her father's records. Victor held them over the edge. "Annie," he called. "This is what you wanted. Put them down." Your father signed every safety form placed in front of him. He also reported the lift. He complained about everything. Then why did you keep his letter? Victor's expression changed. Annie continued. "Why was it stored with your private records instead of the investigation file?" Richard looked toward the case. Victor said, "It meant nothing. It meant enough for you to hide it for 12 years. The detective moved several feet closer behind the barrier. Victor saw him. "Stay back." He threw the bundle toward a maintenance barrel burning near the interior wall. Richard lunged and caught part of it before it reached the flames. Several pages scattered across the wet floor. The rest struck the barrel and slid beneath it, where rainwater had already weakened the fire. Victor moved toward the exterior ladder. The platform dipped. The tool bag struck the railing, tore open, and the hard drive slid across the metal boards. Annie watched it stop near the outer edge. "Richard, the drive is loose." Victor dropped the empty bag and stepped after it. The scaffold twisted. A lower brace broke free, and Victor fell against the railing. The metal gave way beneath his weight. He slipped over the side and caught a horizontal bar with both hands. The hard drive remained on the platform above him. Richard moved toward the opening. The detective grabbed his arm. "The scaffold won't hold both of you." Victor's shoes kicked against open air. "Help me," he shouted. Richard stood above him. For 1 second, no one moved. Victor looked up at the man whose company he had deceived, whose workers he had endangered, and whose silence he had used for years. "You need me alive," Victor said. I can explain everything. Richard's face showed no sympathy. Annie saw him glance toward the hard drive. If Victor fell, the threat ended. If Richard reached for him, the platform might fail again. Annie pressed the radio. Save him. Richard looked toward the camera as though he could see her through it. Annie, save him. He tried to kill Claire. I know. He destroyed your father's name. I know. Then why? Annie's voice shook, but she did not lower it. Because I want justice. Not another body someone can use to bury the truth. The detective removed a rescue line from his belt and secured it around the concrete column. Richard clipped the line to his waist and stepped onto the platform. It sank beneath him. Victor's right hand began to slip. Give me your wrist, Richard said. Victor reached. Richard caught him, but Victor's wet sleeve slid through his hand. Again, the detective tightened the rescue line. Richard caught Victor's forearm with both hands. Victor tried to pull himself up, striking the scaffold with his knees. Stop fighting me, Richard said. I'm trying to climb. You're pulling us both over. The detective joined him at the edge. Together they dragged Victor onto the platform. The moment his body cleared the railing, Victor struck Richard across the face and reached for the hard drive. The detective forced him down and secured his wrists. You are under arrest. Victor pressed his cheek against the wet boards. You have no idea what he knew. Richard wiped blood from his lip. Then you can explain it where every word is recorded. A rescue officer approached from the lower level and retrieved the hard drive. He sealed it inside a waterproof evidence bag. Police collected the scattered papers. James Carter's handwritten warning was found beneath the maintenance barrel, soaked but readable. By dawn, investigators had opened the drive. It contained payroll transfers, false inspection records, supplier payments, and Victor's order reopening the eastern scaffold. Then Claire found a folder marked with James Carter's incident number. Inside was the original maintenance report, a photograph of the failed hydraulic system, and an internal memo written by Victor one day before James died. Replacement will create unacceptable delay. Continue operation until scheduled shutdown. Annie read it beside Evelyn in the temporary command trailer. Her mother covered her mouth. He told the truth, Evelyn whispered. Annie touched her father's signature at the bottom of the warning. Yes, she said. They just decided it cost too much to believe him. Outside, officers led Victor toward a patrol car. Workers watched from behind the barrier. Richard stood apart from Annie and Evelyn. He did not interrupt their grief or ask them to acknowledge what he had done that night. An older detective handed Annie a copy of the recovered report. Justice takes time, he said. Annie looked toward the broken scaffold, the burned office, and the workers waiting for answers. Then someone has to keep it from arriving too late. By noon, the first charges against Victor Crane had been announced. The list was longer than Annie expected. Evidence, destruction, fraud, reckless endangerment, payroll theft, obstruction, and conspiracy. The prosecutor made clear that more charges could follow once investigators finished reviewing the recovered drive. Whitmore Commons remained closed behind fencing and police tape. News vans lined the road. Workers gathered near the entrance in small groups, unsure whether they still had jobs or whether their next paycheck would arrive. Richard stood before them without a podium. You will be paid during the shutdown, he said. Medical coverage remains active. No one will lose a position for cooperating with investigators. Frank Delaney raised his hand. What about retirement contributions? They will continue. And the missing overtime? Every payroll period connected to this project is being reviewed. Frank looked at the other workers before asking, reviewed by the same company that lost it? No, Richard said. An outside accounting firm and representatives chosen by the crews. Daniel, seated in a wheelchair near the front, looked surprised. Richard turned toward him. I would like you to help select them. Daniel rested both hands on the armrests. His injured leg extended in front of him inside a brace. You're asking me now? I should have asked people like you years ago. Daniel did not accept immediately. I'll help if the workers choose me, he said. Not because you do. That is fair. Annie stood beside Evelyn near the rear of the crowd. Her shoulder remained in a sling, and the stitches near her temple had begun to itch. Reporters kept trying to move close enough to photograph her, but Claire had placed security between them and the workers. One reporter called out, Annie, do you consider yourself a whistleblower? She did not answer. Another asked, do you believe Richard Whitmore should be criminally charged? Richard looked toward her but did not interfere. Annie stepped forward only far enough to be heard. My father reported unsafe equipment 12 years ago, she said. Daniel reported unsafe scaffolding this month. Workers reported missing pay. The problem was never that people stayed silent. The problem was that powerful people decided whose voices counted. A reporter asked, "Do you forgive Mr. Whitmore?" "This is not about forgiveness." Richard lowered his eyes. Annie continued, "It is about records being corrected, workers being paid, families receiving answers, and the next warning being heard before someone gets hurt." She returned to Evelyn's side. That afternoon, federal investigators met with the workers inside a church hall near the site. Rosie arrived carrying trays of sandwiches, peach cobbler, and coffee. Members of the church organized rides for people whose vehicles remained inside the sealed project area. Frank brought 12 years of pay statements. Luis Ortega brought copies of medical bills from an injury the company had classified as minor. Tomas arrived with an attorney provided through a worker protection group. He appeared nervous until Annie sat beside him. "Victor knew my papers were being renewed," he said. "He told me one phone call could send me home." "You're not alone now," Annie replied. "What if they say I helped him? Tell them exactly what you did and why." "I loaded the truck. And you warned us." "That doesn't erase the first part." "No," Annie said. "But telling the truth means giving them both." Daniel provided a recorded statement from his wheelchair. He described Victor reopening the scaffold, threatening wages, and using the copied signature. When the investigator asked why he had not contacted authorities earlier, Daniel took a long breath. "I thought I could protect the crew from inside the company," he said. "At some point, loyalty turned into helping the wrong people keep things quiet." After the interview, Annie sat beside him near the church entrance. "You saved people up there," she said. "I also stayed after I knew too much." So did Richard. Daniel glanced toward the front of the hall, where Richard was answering questions from workers without lawyers beside him. "Difference is, men like him get called responsible when they finally admit something," Daniel said. "Men like us get asked why we didn't speak sooner." Annie nodded. "Then we keep saying both." 3 days later, the board of Whitmore Development called Richard to Atlanta. Claire attended as a witness. Annie did not. The directors offered Richard a prepared statement. It described Victor as a dishonest regional officer who had violated established policy without senior management's knowledge. Richard read it once. "This is not true." The board chairman folded his hands. "Victor acted outside policy. He also acted inside the culture we rewarded. That language exposes the company to enormous liability. The company is already liable. You could preserve thousands of jobs by separating his actions from yours." Richard placed the statement back on the table. "I approved the budgets. I accepted lower costs. I promoted executives who finished projects early. I rarely asked what disappeared from those numbers." One director leaned forward. "Are you confessing to crimes?" "No, I am refusing to turn ignorance into innocence." The board voted to remove him as chief executive. Richard did not challenge the decision. He transferred a large portion of his remaining company shares into an independent compensation fund for injured workers, unpaid wages, medical care, and legal claims connected to Crane Industrial Services. When Claire asked whether he understood how much control he was giving up, he answered, "Control is how I avoided hearing people." The investigation continued for several weeks. James Carter's official accident finding was revised. The state report now confirmed that the lifting platform had a known hydraulic defect, that James reported it, and that his actions did not cause his death. An official from the state labor department delivered the corrected report to Evelyn at her kitchen table. Evelyn read every page. "They wrote careless in the first one," she said. The official nodded. "That finding has been removed. They let me believe it for 12 years. I'm sorry." Evelyn closed the folder. "An apology is not 12 years. "No, Mom." After he left, Annie found her mother holding James's old photograph. "He knew what he was doing," Evelyn said. "You always knew that." "I wanted to. That isn't the same." Annie sat beside her. For the first time since the investigation began, neither of them spoke about Victor, Richard, money, or court dates. They sat with the corrected report between them and allowed James's name to rest without accusation beside it. The workers eventually recovered their unpaid overtime. Frank received enough to replace part of the retirement savings he had lost. Daniel began physical therapy and learned he would walk again, though probably with a cane. Richard proposed using a section of land beside Whitmore Commons for a worker support center. He first suggested naming it after Annie. She refused. "This is not my monument." "Then choose the name." "The Carter Workers Center." Richard understood that she meant more than her father. The center would honor James's warning, Evelyn's endurance, and every family forced to accept a company's version of events because they could not afford a lawyer. Its services would include legal support, prescription assistance, safety training, scholarships, whistleblower protection, and a confidential reporting line independent of management. At the first planning meeting, Richard sat halfway down the table rather than at the head. Annie noticed but said nothing. Claire placed a proposal before her. It offered Annie paid college courses, certification in construction safety, and a trainee position with the center's independent compliance office. Annie read the performance standards carefully. "No photographs?" "Not without your approval," Claire said. "No speeches about how Mr. Whitmore rescued me?" Richard answered from across the table. "None." "And if I fail the courses?" "You retake them or choose another path," Claire said. "The position is work, not a reward." Annie signed. Months later, a statue was approved for the center's entrance. Two work-worn hands held a small metal food box. Beneath it, the inscription read, "Dignity is never for sale." At the dedication, Annie stood before workers, retirees, families, church members, and local officials. "Justice is not fair simply because it arrives," she said. "It becomes fair only when it changes what happens to the next person." Behind her, crews returned to Whitmore Commons under independent supervision. This time, when a worker reported a damaged safety line, the section closed before the next shift began. No one asked whether stopping work cost too much. 2 years later, Whitmore Commons opened beneath a clear October sky. The office tower, apartments, retail spaces, and public plaza covered the same ground where Annie had once pushed carts of broken concrete through summer heat. The eastern side of the building no longer carried temporary scaffolding. Wide shaded areas stood near the service entrance, along with cold water stations, first aid cabinets, and safety boards displaying inspection dates in English and Spanish. No report could be closed without the name of the person who corrected the problem. No supervisor could reduce a worker's hours for filing a complaint. A worker representative attended every planning meeting. The rules were printed where everyone could see them, but Annie trusted actions more than signs. She walked through the plaza wearing a white hard hat, work boots, and a reflective vest marked Carter Workers Center Safety and Compliance. Her badge identified her as a junior inspector. A tablet rested beneath one arm, while the old blue food box hung from her other hand. The dents remained. Her father's initials were still visible near the handle. "Miss Carter?" A worker named Malik approached from the loading area. He held a safety line with a damaged metal clasp. "My supervisor says it can make it through the afternoon." Annie examined the hinge. A narrow crack ran beside the locking mechanism. "Who inspected this?" "He said it passed last month." "That wasn't my question." Malik nodded toward the west trailer. "Ray Thompson." Annie photographed the clasp, entered the serial number into her tablet, and called the site superintendent. "Close the west loading platform until every line from this shipment is checked." The superintendent hesitated. "We have a delivery coming in 40 minutes. Then it can wait. That could set the crew back half a day." Annie looked at Malik. "The platform closes now." The superintendent gave the order without further argument. Malik released a breath. "I thought they'd tell me to keep using it. They might have 2 years ago. What changed?" "People stopped treating warnings like complaints." She handed him a replacement line and watched him return to the crew. Near the center of the plaza, the Carter Workers Center stood behind a row of young oak trees. Its ground floor provided legal consultations, prescription assistance, safety training, and support for injured workers. Upstairs, students attended evening classes in construction management and labor law. Annie was completing her associate degree at Stonebridge Community College. She attended classes 3 nights a week and worked at the center during the day. Her grades were strong, though she still checked every assignment twice before submitting it. Evelyn's health remained fragile but stable. Her medications arrived on schedule, and she had stopped hiding empty bottles beneath kitchen towels. She volunteered at the center twice a week, helping families complete medical forms, Daniel chaired the Worker Safety Council. He walked with a cane and complained that physical therapists enjoyed making respectable men suffer. Claire directed the Independent Compliance Office. She had developed a habit of placing important records in 3 locations, then checking all 3 before going home. Rosie had retired from full-time work at the cafe, though no one in Stonebridge believed she had truly retired. She arrived at every center event with coffee, biscuits, or peach pie, and left after giving instructions to people who had not asked for them. Richard Whitmore no longer controlled Whitmore Development. He had 1 seat on the center's advisory board and 1 vote, the same as every other member. He received no salary. He attended meetings without an assistant and had learned that listening did not require preparing a response. Annie found him beneath the section of the building where the eastern scaffolding had once stood. He sat on a wooden bench near the worker break area, reading a safety report. He wore khaki pants, a light jacket, and shoes that could survive construction dust. "You're early," Annie said. Richard closed the report. "I was told inspectors value punctuality. Only when other people practice it." She sat beside him and placed the blue food box between them. Richard noticed the initials near the handle. "You still carry it. It still works. That is usually your argument for keeping everything." "It's a good argument." Annie opened the box. Inside were 2 turkey sandwiches, 2 apples, and a thermos of sweet tea. She handed him 1 sandwich. Richard accepted it, then looked at her with a restrained smile. "How much do I owe you?" Annie shook her head. "You still don't understand. Some things aren't a transaction. I thought I understood that by now. You're improving." They ate while workers gathered at nearby tables. Conversations moved through baseball scores, truck repairs, mortgages, aching knees, grandchildren, and retirement plans. No private table had been prepared for Richard. Daniel crossed the plaza with his cane. "You 2 planning company policy without us?" he asked. "We're eating lunch," Annie said. "That's how company policy starts." Richard offered him an apple. Daniel took it. "I accept this without conditions." "You've learned from Annie," Richard said. "I learned not to trust billionaires carrying bank cards." "Former billionaire," Richard corrected. Daniel examined the apple. "Still richer than me." "Almost everyone is richer than you," Annie said. Daniel pointed the apple at her. "Respect your elders. You're 50 years too young to use that line." He laughed and continued toward the center. Richard watched him go. "He still believes I should have faced criminal charges. He may be right." "I know." Annie looked at him. 2 years earlier, that answer would have surprised her. Richard no longer rushed to separate guilt from responsibility. He folded the sandwich wrapper and placed it inside the food box. "The day we met," he said, "I thought I was testing your character." "You were." He turned toward her. "You just didn't know whose character was being tested," she added. Richard nodded. "I believed money could reveal what people really wanted. It revealed what you expected from them." "That too." He looked across the plaza toward the memorial outside the Carter Workers Center. The sculpture showed 2 work-worn hands holding a small metal lunchbox. Beneath it were the words, "Dignity is never for sale. I told you I would give you something worth far more," Richard said. "You offered me a bank card. I meant after that. You offered a job, and medical care, school, a different future." Annie closed the thermos. "Those things mattered. I'm not going to pretend they didn't. But they weren't the most valuable?" "No." Richard waited. Annie looked toward the center entrance. Evelyn was helping a woman organize prescription forms. Claire stood nearby speaking with 3 trainees. Daniel greeted an older welder who had come to review his retirement settlement. A family posed beside James Carter's name on the memorial wall. "The most valuable thing was that somebody finally stayed long enough to hear the truth," Annie said. Richard followed her gaze. "You stayed too," he replied. "I didn't have anywhere else to go. You could have walked away." "So could you." "I almost did." "I know." There was no anger in the answer now, but neither was there easy forgiveness. Richard had learned that redemption was not a moment someone granted him. It was a responsibility renewed through each decision. A radio at Annie's belt sounded. "Safety office. West platform is clear. Replacement lines are installed and ready for inspection." Annie stood. Richard nodded toward the unfinished half of her sandwich. "You aren't going to finish?" "I will after the inspection." "You used to say that when you had no food. Now I have another sandwich in the center." She closed the food box and handed it to him. "Hold this." Richard accepted it. Annie walked toward the west loading platform. Malik waited beside the new safety lines, along with the superintendent who had complained about the delay. Annie checked each clasp, anchor, and inspection tag before allowing the section to reopen. No one rushed her. No one asked whether the lost 40 minutes cost too much. Richard remained on the bench with the blue box resting on his knees. He ran one finger across James Carter's initials and watched Annie speak to the crew. 2 years earlier, she had sat beneath scaffolding with one sandwich and more responsibility than anyone around her understood. He had placed money before her because he believed wealth gave him the right to measure her. She had answered by offering him everything she had. That afternoon, beneath the shadow of a building once raised on silence, a former billionaire and a young woman who had once cleared its rubble shared an ordinary meal. Richard Whitmore had promised Annie Carter something more valuable than the food in her hands. In the end, Annie had been the one to give it to him. Not forgiveness purchased with money. Not admiration earned through power, but the chance to become a man worthy of the wealth he had once possessed, and the truth that no fortune, however vast, was worth more than a human life believed in time. The story reminds us that dignity cannot be bought, and kindness loses its meaning when it becomes a transaction. It also shows that justice begins when people in power choose to listen to those who are usually ignored. True leadership is not measured by wealth, titles, or reputation, but by the courage to admit failure, protect the vulnerable, and change the system so the next person is treated fairly. Most of all, the story teaches that no human life should ever be valued less than profit. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.